Imagine a man who made billions of dollars running a hedge fund, then decided that his success proved he had discovered the fundamental laws of reality itself. Not the laws of finance, not even the laws of economics, reality. Human nature, history. The universe. Now imagine that man wrote a book called Principles, sold millions of copies, and convinced a generation of MBA students, tech executives, and podcast hosts that he had cracked the code of human existence, using the same logic he used to bet on currencies. That man is Ray Dalio. And today, we're going to use the tools of serious philosophy to examine exactly what he's selling, and why so much of it is, intellectually speaking, a disaster. Ray Dalio founded Bridgewater Associates in 1975, eventually turning it into the largest hedge fund in the world. By most financial measures, the man is extraordinarily successful. Nobody serious disputes that. In 2017, he published Principles, a compendium of the management rules and life guidelines he had developed over decades. The book became a global phenomenon. It presents itself as a system, a coherent, universal framework for decision-making, for understanding human nature, for navigating reality itself. Dalio calls these principles algorithms for the brain. He claims they are derived from rigorous observation, from radical transparency, from what he calls knowing how to deal with what you don't know. He positions himself not as a guru, he's careful about that, but as a man who has reverse-engineered reality through superior discipline. This is the claim we are here to examine. Not whether Dalio is rich, not whether his fund performed well, but whether his intellectual framework deserves the philosophical authority it implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, demands. The short answer is no. The longer answer is what makes this interesting. Mario Bunge, one of the 20th century's most rigorous philosophers of science, had a name for assertions that dress up in the clothes of science without doing the actual work: superscientific claims. Claims that exceed what evidence or method can actually support. Dalio's Principles is structurally built on them. Consider one of his foundational assertions, that all organisms, human beings, companies, economies, civilizations, operate according to a universal logic he calls the machine. Quote, "I think of the world as a machine and believe that for every effect there is a cause." He presents this not as a working metaphor, not as a heuristic, but as a discovered law. But here is the problem. Dalio derives these universal laws primarily from a single dataset. His own career at Bridgewater, running a specific type of organization in a specific historical period, in a specific geopolitical context, using a specific financial strategy. That is not how you establish universal principles. That is how you establish a case study. The philosopher of science would ask, what would falsify this? Dalio doesn't ask. He is not building a testable framework. He is constructing a theology and calling it engineering. He has committed the cardinal sin of induction without scruple, generalizing from a narrow, self-selected sample of one life to the operating system of all human reality. The hedge fund worked. Therefore, universal laws of nature. The logic is breathtaking in its circularity. Dalio is, it must be said, a gifted communicator. His animated video How the Economic Machine Works has over 40 million views. It is simple, clear, and memorable. It is also philosophically pernicious. The machine metaphor is not just an analogy for Dalio, it is his ontology. It is what he believes reality fundamentally is. Economies are machines. Companies are machines. Human beings are machines. The brain is a machine running faulty algorithms that better algorithms can correct. This can be identified as a defective metaphor, one that substitutes rhetorical vividness for actual argument, and in doing so, smuggles in an entire metaphysical worldview without subjecting it to scrutiny. Here is what the machine metaphor systematically cannot accommodate: emergence. When you describe an economy as a machine, you are implying that its behavior is, in principle, fully reducible to the sum of its components and their interactions, that there are no properties at the systemic level that cannot be predicted from, or reduced to, the lower-level parts. But economies produce phenomena, trust, panic, institutional culture, speculative manias, that are not present in any of their components and cannot be derived from them by addition. These are emergent properties. They exist at the meso and macro levels. The machine metaphor annihilates them. And when your metaphor annihilates the most important features of the thing you're trying to understand, your metaphor is not a simplification. It is a falsification. Dalio has made a career of being surprised by black swans, events his models failed to predict, and then updating his models. He presents this as intellectual humility. But it is something less flattering, the iterative patching of a fundamentally misconceived framework that refuses to question its own foundations. Dalio's management philosophy, radical transparency, algorithmic decision-making, recording all meetings, scoring employees on behavioral attributes in real time, produced a functioning, profitable organization. He then extrapolates this directly to how families should operate, how governments should govern, how society should self-organize. This is reductive fallacy at its most brazen. Bungay is unambiguous on this point. You cannot simply translate properties and dynamics from one level of systemic organization to another without accounting for what changes in the transition. A firm is not a family. A family is not a civilization. Each level of social organization has its own emergent properties, its own dynamics, its own constraints. What functions at the micro level of a tightly controlled financial institution, where employees are selected, compensated, and can resign, tells you almost nothing about what functions at the macro level of a democracy or a society. But Dalio doesn't merely suggest the analogy. He presents it as derivation. The same principles, he argues, apply everywhere, because everywhere is ultimately the same machine running the same algorithm. This is not systems thinking. This is the opposite of systems thinking. It is the assumption that all systems are equivalent, which is precisely what a rigorous ontology of systems exists to refute. It is the kind of thinking that gives us tech billionaires redesigning cities, charter schools, and democratic institutions on the model of a startup, and then expressing bewilderment when these social tissues, which evolved over centuries to manage genuine complexity and genuine conflict, refuse to behave like product teams at a Series B company. Bungay identified methodological subjectivism as one of the deepest pathologies in social and philosophical thought, the elevation of first-person experience to the status of intersubjective evidence. The confusion of autobiography with epistemology. Ray Dalio's entire intellectual edifice rests on this confusion. His principles are derived from his experience. His evidence for their validity is his success. His success is measured by standards that his principles define as constituting success. The circularity is not incidental, it is structural. At no point in principles does Dalio submit his framework to the kind of intersubjective scrutiny that would be required to move it from personal testimony to knowledge. He does not identify a control group of comparably intelligent, comparably resourced individuals who did not follow his principles and measure outcomes. He does not account for survivorship bias, the vast population of people who followed similar frameworks and were never heard from because they did not become billionaires. He does not consider the degree to which his success was contingent on historical circumstances, a specific regime of global financialization, regulatory environments, macroeconomic conditions that his principles neither predict nor explain. He has written a very well-organized account of how one specific person understood his own life, filtered through the cognitive biases that all human beings possess, including the very powerful bias of confusing correlation with causation when the correlated variable is one's own brilliance. This is not a philosophy. It is a memoir with a superiority complex. Yet Ray Dalio is not a fraud. He is something in some ways more dangerous. A genuinely intelligent man who has mistaken success for understanding and mistaken understanding for wisdom and mistaken wisdom for universal law, and who has the resources and the platform to propagate that confusion at civilizational scale. His principles may function for certain people in certain contexts in certain historical windows. So do horoscopes. So does the advice in fortune cookies. The question is never whether something works sometimes for someone. The question is whether the claimed explanation for why it works is actually true. By the standards of serious philosophy, by the standards of ontological rigor, of evidentiary discipline, of systemic thinking, Dalio's framework fails. It reduces emergence to mechanism. It universalizes the local. It launders autobiography into epistemology. It dresses a metaphor in the clothes of a law. The machine is how Dalio needs to believe reality works, because if it did, his success would be engineered, not merely fortunate. And that is a very different kind of billionaire.